Ciao a tutti. This is Stefano in my newest installment of interesting folks that I've met in the wine business, thanks to Giowine and Batasiolo. So I've been working in the wine business for 15 years, and this year we're taking a different approach to the wine business. So trying to make sure that we can stay in touch with everybody digitally as well. So I'm very excited about today's guest. We're going to be talking with Emmanuel Kemiji. So I'm going to bring him on board right now. Make sure it's working over here. Perfect. Ciao.
Ciao, Stefano. Good to see you this evening.
Good to see you as well. So I'm going to do a little introduction of you now that you're here, that I have you, that put you online. So you are a Master Sommelier. You were the 12th ever in the United States. Before that, though, you were born in the United States, but you grew up in Spain and England. Is that correct?
Yep.
And you came back to the United States to go to UC Davis to major. You got degrees in both economics and Spanish literature because just studying viticulture and enology was not enough. So you wanted to be a well-rounded individual. So congratulations on that. You were also the first Master Sommelier to found a commercial winery, which is incredibly impressive. So you have both Mira, which specializes in premier California Chardonnays, mostly Napa for the Chardonnays and mostly Santa Lucia and Monterey for the Pinot Noir. Is that correct?
Right.
Excellent. And you have Clos Pizarra in Priorat in Spain.
Right.
Okay, that was a brief introduction because I literally tried to write an introduction that was a page long and I tried to cut it down a little bit. But does that cover some of the more salient points of?
That does. That's enough to begin with, anyway.
That's enough to begin with. All right. So speaking of beginnings, I wanted to start with how you and I had met, and it was actually, as far as my recollection goes, it was through Giovanni Cardullo, my boss, and we have Dan already saying hello, Dan Drex. Hello. And Giovanni Cardullo said, I know this great guy. He has some spare time, so he's the consulting wine director of Lamar, Peruvian Restaurant in San Francisco. And he said, you absolutely have to talk to him because it's a beautiful restaurant and cevicheria. But I believe at the time, it was mostly a North and South American wine list. Am I remembering correctly?
Yes. The idea behind the wine list is, as it's Peruvian food, that we would only have South American wines, Spanish wines because of the Spanish influence on Peruvian food. There's also a big Chinese and Japanese influence on Peruvian food, but not of so much importance in terms of wine. And then we also added California wines because we're using California product,
local
California, to make this amazing Peruvian food that Gaston Acurio makes.
So I had the great pleasure to meet you and have some lovely food. I was utterly unsuccessful to sell you any Batasiolo wines because of the correct, focus of the wine list. And you can't expand when you have a focus, you got to stick to that focus. So I was very admirable and I understood that.
And I love Batasiolo wines, by the way. And Lorenzo is an incredible person that I've enjoyed meeting on a few occasions. So
yeah, and coming a little bit more to this year, that was almost a dozen years ago. And just recently, you did a blind tasting on some Batasiolo wines at the house in Puerto Rico.
Yes.
So we were able to connect again there, and we've had a couple more discussions since there. So I thought it'd be great fun to have you on board today, and kind of look back at history a little bit and talk about what's going forward. So I appreciate you taking the time and being able to spend some more time with you face to face, even if digitally.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about your past. So when you started, you're the 12th ever Master Sommelier in the United States. How many Master Somms were there when you were starting on when you had that as a goal?
There were 11.
11? Oh, wow. So in that time, no one else was able to...
No. I was fortunate. I got introduced to the program by Fred Dame.
Okay.
Who's the one that started the American chapter in the United States after he passed in 1984. And Fred at that time was head of national fine wine accounts for the Sterling Group. And I was working at the Ritz-Carlton Laguna Niguel as the director of wine there. And so we were one of his stops around the country. So we became friends. And one day he says, "Oh, you've got to be a part of this program." And that was in the early part of 1989. And I knew nothing of the program at the time. But I thought, this is what a great challenge. Here I've spent, the last 10 years of my life making wine first a hobby, then a profession, and then a life. And what's the gauge? How do I gauge how successful, how good, how not good? And so I ended up taking the advanced exam in May of that year in Chicago. And then in November of '89, that same year, went to London and had a good day. They asked the right questions. So, and that was the process. So even though it was a short time in terms of within a year that I started and became an MS, that's really not correct, because it was 10 years of studying on my own, just because I loved wine and I enjoyed history and reading about it and the culture and the personalities involved. So yes, it was a short time in the program to pass, but it actually was a long time to actually get to that point, to even begin.
You've been preparing for a lot of part of your life. You're not specifically for that program, but you were already well versed and you had been studying for a while.
Exactly.
Now, we actually know somebody in common. We found out last time we met, and it's actually Daryl Cordy up in Sacramento, who has a phenomenal store and is an incredible resource on wines. But I don't think he ever really did any standardized studying. So just curious what his first words to you were when you told him, I'm embarking on this quest.
Well, I mean, when I got out of Davis, I actually worked at Cordy Brothers for Daryl. I convinced him, after pestering him incessantly, to let me work for him, because I yet to have to meet another person pound for pound that knows more about food and wine than Daryl Cordy.
Yeah.
An extraordinary person, and I've been blessed to count him as my mentor for the last 30, 40 years that I've been in this business. And so I remember I worked at Cordy Brothers for a year, and then I felt like I had to leave Sacramento. And so I went to visit different places around the state, and with a recommendation letter from him, and everywhere that I went, I got offered a job because of his recommendation, not because of my own, because my curriculum vitae was very short. But I ended up getting a job as a sommelier, and I remember calling Daryl. Says, "Daryl, I just got a job as a sommelier at this private club in Newport Beach, the Pacific Club, which still exists today. And at that time, they were just opening it." And he says, "You don't know anything about being a sommelier." I said, "Daryl, that's why I'm calling you. I need to figure out how to write a wine list." So he says, "Fly up here." And I flew up to Sacramento. He spent the weekend teaching me, all the correct procedures as far as how to serve, how to properly showcase a bottle, how to write a wine list, and then took off from there.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And just thinking about like when you were starting, and obviously Daryl was a great influence. I'm curious, if I'm not mistaken, you were the first Hispanic Master Sommelier, either in the United States or in the world. Is that accurate?
The first Hispanic in the world, because I was the 58th person that became a Master Sommelier worldwide, and the first Hispanic. Yes, I grew up in Spain and England. My mother was Spanish. My father was Greek Cypriot. So yes, at that time, the first. Happy to say that some others have joined me since. So,
which is great. I'm just curious, what was that like for you? Being the first. I mean, was there any other things going on in your head? What was the tasting groups you were in? Was it inspiring? Was it more challenging being the first, or
the tasting group consisted of one.
Very expensive tasting group to be a one-person tasting group.
Well, and here is where I have to really thank. I was working like I mentioned, I was working at this time I was working at the Ritz Carlton in Laguna Niguel, and Henry Sheeline, the general manager, and Joe Violi, the food and beverage director at the time, just were so supportive, and whatever I needed in terms of wines and traveling and paying for these exams and these flights, the Ritz completely took care of all of that, which was of enormous help. So it's thanks to their support that I could. Because back then, in South Orange County, there was hardly any Somms at all. The only I will say there was one person that helped me a lot, and that was Rene Chassots, who actually took my place at the Pacific Club, and until he passed away, unfortunately, recently. He was the wine director there. And Rene was this great old French guy that knew service upside down. And I knew that if I was going to go to take this test in England, that the English it's all about French service. And Rene had won the best French sommelier competition, I believe, in the country, or had been a finalist. I think he won. But regardless, he was extremely knowledgeable about wine, and but especially about service. And so it's due in great part to Rene's advice and teachings that I passed the service part of the exam.
It sounds like you had a lot of great mentors along the way to help you hone your craft for the exam and for what you're doing.
No, and absolutely. And without people like Daryl and also David Berkeley of Cordy Brothers, who was the White House wine advisor for 3 or 4 presidents, and was one of the managers of one of the Cordy Brothers stores. And I worked for him for a number of times also. And guys like Rene Chassots, there's no possible way. I certainly wouldn't have passed on the first time if it wasn't for those guys.
Fantastic. Every once in a while, I got to throw in something Italian, because you have some great knowledge about Spain and France and England and the United States. Out of curiosity, if you remember, if you have to guess, how many DOCGs were there in Italy when you were studying for the master?
Well, every year you get a bunch more. So 30 years ago, there weren't that many. DOCGs, there were just 4. The original 4.
We're up to 75 or 76 now. It's we were just talking about that just recently. Is that
you and I were having a discussion about that? How I think that's a pity and a travesty at the same point, because I think it devalues wines like Barolo and Barbaresco and Brunello, who are world-class wines and deserve to be on a higher echelon than today, where I think, unfortunately, a lot of this has become political rather than qualitative. And I think it becomes very challenging for consumers. And as a som, I'm always very critical of wine laws that make wine more complicated. And I think too many producers, not just in Italy, in many different parts, in California now we have 14 or 16 AVAs in Napa Valley. I mean, we forget that the end result is to make wine more appealing to consumers so that they buy more, and we're making it more complicated along the way, more intimidating, and I think that's what we need to change.
Yeah, I can see there's definitely some value in drilling down and being able to know meter by meter what's going on with the soil and have that information. But sometimes we focus too much maybe on that. Just like, for example, now there's quite a bit of, division amongst producers in Barolo, whether you focus on the larger sub-areas of Barolo or the 181 sub-areas, the Menzione Geografica Aggiuntive, where, what worth is there sometimes to focusing too much on the particulars versus, getting a general sense of why things are the way they are. So I think that was a very fruitful argument where I started a little defensive, and then I'm like, I'm talking with a master sommelier here. I should probably defer.
No. And I think it's the kind of discussions that we don't have enough of. That both sides, and I think need to understand that producers value the place and the identity of the wines that they make, and that's very, very important. On the other hand, we need to translate that into a language that the consumer, who in the end is the most important part of this equation, can understand and get their heads around.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I want to comment on as well that you said earlier is that sometimes the political intervention can be well-meaning, but sometimes it can just dilute the idea and make it confusing. Just like last week, I was talking to a doctoral student, Sara Cardullo, about how language is really an official language for a country is really just a political construct. There's so many languages that can be spoken in a country, whether there needs to be one official language was having maybe sometimes just a political idea as opposed to, let's value the beauty of what's inside that country. To me, that kind of reminds me to what you're talking about now about, let's enjoy wine for what it is and get it to the consumer so they can enjoy it as easily as possible. So that was just a little, I just wanted to relate back to that. On a more serious note, just to finish talking about the Master Quarter Sommelier before we move on to your past projects and really focus more on your new projects. It's been a kind of a busy, tumultuous year for the Court of Master Sommeliers, but the last 2 years, there was quite a bit of focus on maybe there should be some transparency in the exam process. During Black Lives Matter, there was definitely a focus on whether the court should respond officially, be more reactive to some of the calls for diversity. And just recently, there have been some renewed calls for some taking to task some of the sexual harassment that's been happened quite a few times. So I just want to see if you want to respond to any of those, if you think there's a systematic issue with the court, or if it's something that just, I just want to take a sip of wine and see what your thoughts were on those.
Sure. Well, first off, I have in the 30 years 31 years now, that I've been involved with the court, I have never heard or felt that my colleagues have demonstrated any bias towards gender or race. Are there enough women in the court? Are there enough African Americans or Latinos in the court? No. But that's not because the court has excluded them or made it more difficult. That is kind of a reflection of the industry and where it's at, and definitely those things need to change. And we need to make it easier, but I don't feel like we've made it difficult. I mean, are there enough African Americans or females that own great restaurants in this country? No. Is that reflective of the amount of people that females and people of race that work? No. But whose fault is that? It's not a simple question to answer. Now, in regards to that, we have taken to task that we need to see how we can help the people that want to become master sommeliers and make it easier. We have, because of the sexual harassment issues that you pointed out, that I think are abhorrent, that have occurred, where unfortunately a small minority has taken advantage of their position. So we have undertaken kind of a look from A to Z at our organization and what we need to do, what safeguards we need to put in so that this don't happen, how we can change, be more inclusive, and deal with problems like the ones that surfaced a month ago. To that end, we have a whole new board got voted in. The old board resigned amidst the pressure. We're hiring an external CEO, understanding that we need somebody that has more knowledge and can guide, because now this has become much bigger than what it originally started out as. And also hiring a human resource external person. We've hired a firm to investigate, an outside firm to investigate the wrongdoings by certain members, because we felt that it would compromise the whole process by having master sommeliers investigate master sommeliers. So is it perfect? No. Is there a lot of work that needs to be done? Absolutely. But in the very least, we've acknowledged that and are working on it. That's what I can say on the matter at this time.
I appreciate that. When I sent you some things I was thinking about talking about with you that wasn't in the original set of topics, but I felt that obviously it's a very important institution, and what was maybe seen on social media was there wasn't a lot of response. So I appreciate you addressing some of those points, and I think there's some really positive changes, and that's great. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about that a bit. Let's take a switch now. Let's talk about some of your projects. Let's start with some of the ones you started with. So we have here, I'm going to do a split screen here. So let's see how seamless it works. How does that look on your screen? Is that pretty visible?
That looks good on my screen.
Okay. So let's actually start with Mira. So this was your first project, the first when you decided to actually start more hands-on winemaking. So I'm going to have you talk just really briefly about Mira and Clos Pizarra, and then we'll focus more on your new projects. Does that sound okay? So just give us a little bit of information about Mira and Clos Pizarra and what your thought process were and how it started.
Absolutely. So Mira started, I started Mira back in 1995. And as you mentioned, at that time was the first som to commercially start a winery in this country. Mira today is more focused on Pinot Noir more than anything, from some of the top Pinot vineyards in California. We do a Pisoni, we do a Rocchioli, we do a Morning Dew Ranch up in Anderson Valley that used to belong to Burt Williams of Williams & Sullivan fame. It started with myself and some chefs, some Ritz-Carlton, some not, hanging around one night. And actually, it was one of the chefs that said, "Hey, why, we all love wine and we're an hour away from Napa. Wouldn't it be cool to experience a harvest firsthand?" And they said, "Hey, Kemiji, you're supposedly the hotshot master sommelier that went to Davis. How about if we put up the money and you had this project?" And unfortunately, I had too much cognac to drink, and I said, "Sure." So that's how Mira got started, and with a lot of help of friends. Augustin Hineo Sr. sold us 2.5 tons of Cabernet from Quintessa that first year, and Alain Fouquet got me some barrels last minute from Seguin Moreau, and then Kerner Rombauer Jr. Let me make the wine at Rombauer. So that's how it got started, and then it just grew, and what became a fun little project turned into a great new challenge. And then right before the harvest of '99, I left the Ritz to concentrate solely on Mira. And then Clos Pizarra, I had wanted to do something in Spain because of my heritage and because it was an uncle in Madrid that got me hooked on wine. And he's like a second father. So I had run around Spain for a couple of years in between '99 and 2001, to all the obvious places, Rioja, Ribera del Duero, so on and so forth, and came away with the idea that the most interesting place to start a new wine project were these two tiny, at that time, kind of off the map regions, Montsant and Priorat. And so I was actually having lunch at Piperad in San Francisco one day, and had walked out, and it was a wine luncheon, or we're tasting a bunch of wines, and I saw that the owner, Gerald Hirigoyen, and another chef, Laurent Manrique, were having lunch outside outside a little terrace there. So I stopped by to say hi as their friends. And actually, Gerald was one of the original founders of Mira. And so we started talking and having some wine. And they said, "Oh, what are you up to?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually going to leave for Spain tomorrow because I'm thinking of the idea of buying a vineyard near Tarragona, about 60 miles south of Barcelona." And they looked at me and said, "Well, we want to be a part of that." And said, "About how much is it going to cost?" And I said a number, and they each wrote a check right there. And I said,
Must have been a good lunch. Wow.
Well, I think a lot of wine was had, which is always a problem. I said, "But you guys haven't even seen this place." They said, "Look, if you think it's the right thing, we want to do it." And then we have another close French chef who I had worked with at the Ritz-Carlton San Francisco, Sylvain Portet. And said, "Well, if we don't tell Sylvain about it, he's going to be pissed at all of us." And so we said, "Well, we better call him." And we called Sylvain on the phone and said, "Oh, look, we're doing this." And he says, "Well, why don't you come by the house and pick up a check?" And so 4 of us, that was the beginning of July. On July 30th or 31st, I bought a 5-acre vineyard in Montsant of 100% Grenache. And 5 weeks later, we were harvesting it. And at that time, using the winery of a friend that I was consulting for nearby. And that started Clos Pizarra. Then some other friends found out and wanted to be a part of it. So today we have about 60 acres between Montsant and Priorat, about roughly half and half. And we built a facility that we finished in 2011. That's why I have so much white hair. I'll never build another winery again from scratch in my life. But it's been a great project. It's given us, a lot of good times, a lot of great wine, and Montsant Priorat is a very special place. It really is a unique place where wine is made in this planet. So
never say never. I mean, who knows what kind of lunch or dinner you'll have and wine and cognac you'll have. You may do another winery yet. In fact, you've actually started a slew of new projects. You have 5 new projects. So my question, I guess, the main question is, what are you eating in Puerto Rico that you're having these great meals with all these new ideas? What's going on?
That's what happens when you're in a pandemic and you have too much time on your hands.
But you don't seem to have gained any weight. I mean, it's all just turning into ideas. So let's talk about the first project. We'll start with L plus I, if that's okay.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about L plus I.
L plus I is an idea. Traveling around the country, visiting distributors and going around wine stores and so on, restaurants and hotels all over the country. A few years ago, I saw how I started to see wine in cans all over the place. And at first, old school, everything has to have a cork and stuff. I said, oh my God, what's the world coming to, right? And I started seeing it more and more, and then kind of was reading some literature on cans and the effectiveness, the carbon footprint, advantages, the recyclability, the non-spoilage factor, the versatility. And at that time, I saw a lot of kind of mom and pop people making that. At that time, really, Underwood was the only, what I would say, more serious of a scale. And I thought, oh gosh, what if somebody tried to take this to another level in terms of packaging and wine and kind of concept? So I started thinking about what that would look like and came up with this concept. And actually what you see, what appears to be a cluster of grapes is actually thumbprints. The idea being that, cans are seen almost as an industrialized thing, very impersonal. And the idea is to bring a human touch to it. L plus I is derived from the Confucian philosophy for the order flow, the beautiful dancing pattern of liquid. That's what happens when you drink too much and start thinking about names.
Very nice. Very nice.
So
go ahead.
No, so that's I produced 4 different wines that launched in California in July, and now we have it in about 6 or 7 states.
Great.
Obviously, this has been a challenging time to launch new projects, but still have found some traction, and the response so far has been very positive.
So we got the Chardonnay, Pinot Grigio, Rosé of Pinot Noir, and the Bloc, which is a red blend. So I actually tried all these. They're fabulous. And if I'm not mistaken, these are the first canned wines by a Master Sommelier. Is that accurate?
The first canned wines made by Master Sommelier in California. Oh. My colleague Bobby Stuckey makes in Friuli has canned some wine, I think some sparkling wine.
I think he does a Lambrusco, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Also,
yeah,
yeah,
Lambrusco. That's exactly it.
yeah.
But in this country, this is the first time.
Oh man, missed it by that much. No, that's fabulous. I mean, I think it's great. Like you were talking about the customer experience. The packaging of the can. We're used to thinking of the bottle, the glass, the cork, but great quality wine can be delivered in whatever package. And I mean, this is a really handy way to be able to serve a nice glass of wine into whether you serve it into a glass or whatever you want to serve it to. Is the quality of the wine was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Alrighty, let's. What do you want to talk next about? Lunisa or?
Sure. Let's talk about Lunisa.
Let's keep it on wine for now.
Sure. So Lunisa is a project that I started thinking about just about a year or so ago. I live in Puerto Rico, and wine here is a big part of the culture. And Hispanics in the United States are becoming a powerful consumer. And it's said to be that 40% of the growth in the next 20 years in the wine business will be because of Hispanic consumers.
Wow.
And so I thought, well, I'm Hispanic. How about trying to put together a project not to exclude Anglo or American consumers, but perhaps something more directed to Hispanic consumers, not just in the United States, but in Puerto Rico, or as Giovanni and I proposed to Mexico too, and other places in South and Central America. So I thought, let's make a California wine that has an easy to pronounce name in Spanish. At the same time, you can pronounce it in English. That has a cool story, and that's made by a Hispanic, and at a price point where many entry-level drinkers of that nature are coming in and wanting something of quality, but don't want to start out paying $20 a bottle as their first wine. So that was kind of the idea. And I remember talking to Giovanni Cardullo, and he said, God, that's a great idea. My distributor in Mexico is looking for something like that. So with Giovanni's help, we kind of put together this, took it to the next level, and are now working on making it happen.
Fantastic. And as a master sommelier, when you're crafting these wines, you obviously have this consumer in mind. Organoleptically, are you creating the wines in a certain way? Or are you just making the wines as if, wine for wine's sake? Or was there any thought process to?
I think it's always dangerous to when you're making, to think that you can make a wine that is going to appeal to a large group of people, that you think that you can come up with this formula or something. And we've seen the many surprises along the way that were accidents or white Zinfandel. Who would have thunk in 1970 that white Zinfandel would ever become the salvation of Zinfandel in California?
Of the grape itself, yes.
Yeah. Who would have thought that wines like The Prisoner would get the traction that they have? I never go into making a wine thinking I'm going to make this wine with this in mind. in this case, I have an idea of the target price I want to achieve. So something in that $10 range. I said, what is the best wine I can make in that price range? How do I make the best wine I can in that price range? That's kind of what I try to do.
That's cool. That's great. I mean, $10 is a great price point. So my hat's off to you. That's fantastic. Alrighty. Shall we move on to beer next? Because as a master sommelier, you can't just know wine. You got to know every single beverage and cigar out there, and on top of everything else. So this was a surprising product to me. I didn't know about this till you pulled this out. So let's talk about the beer a little bit.
Sure. So, well, as you know, there's a little adage in the business: it takes a lot of beer to make good wine, because that's what most of us are drinking at harvest. So, always enjoyed a good beer. And, you know, some years ago, again, in that same thing of traveling around and seeing how the craft beer projects were exploding. And again, seeing a lot of craft beer that two things. A lot of it was very heavy-handed, very high alcohols, kind of over the top, a lot of cartoony skull and bones kind of thing. And I thought, God, what if I'm a Heineken drinker? I'm not going to go from my 5% Heineken to a 10% triple IPA. But I am interested in higher quality. I have the disposable income to afford and appreciate something of higher quality. So that's when I started thinking about, what if a master sommelier and a master brewer got together and came up with a concept. And I had a friend who had actually worked for a couple of harvests at our winery, who had started a brewery of his own with a couple of friends in Opelika, Alabama, which is right next to Auburn University. The culinary program there is run by an experts Carlton guy, and hence why I know these guys.
All beverage world.
All beverage was a very small world out there. And so I proposed this idea because they had always wanted to do something with me, and thought, God, we love your wine. If we could ever figure out something to do. And I proposed this idea. What if we put together craft beer with a historical and geographic sense of place, not just kind of the flavor of the week, which seems to be happening with so many craft breweries.
Yeah, 24 seasonal beers throughout the year that are impossible to find.
So, we put this concept together. We came up with three beers. We're working on a couple more, but these are going to be the staples. And we did the one that's on the screen, a dark.
Actually, let me stop you real quick before we get into the different styles of beer that you have. There's a question here in San Diego. Joyce was interested in your L+I. She was wondering if there's already retail available of the canned wines.
Yes, the canned wines are available. Classic Wines of California is the distributor in California. So your local wine shop or supermarket can certainly ask for them, or if you write to me, I can find out somebody in your area that
may already have them on the shelf.
Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, cool. I'll get back to Joyce about that if you. So yeah, let's go back to the beer. I just want to make sure we didn't forget about that because that was an important question. Um,
Sure.
so yeah, so there's a couple different styles. So let's start with the Dark Cape. So
So
one of the things before you start, one of the things that really appealed to me, like what you talked about, is the geography and the sense of style and the intention behind it. So I really like the history and the geography and the philosophy behind the different beers. So let's go through the different beers.
sure. So Dark Cape is a Caribbean stout. Like I said, I live in Puerto Rico, and when I think of the Caribbean, I think of two things above all. I think of coffee and rum. So this is coffee from one of the top estates in Puerto Rico, and aged in rum barrels from a small producer here in Puerto Rico. It's all made in Alabama, but the products come from here. And it's an English style stout because it was the English that really fomented the brewing culture in the Caribbean. Um, and so by that, it's a stout of about 6% alcohol, not the big imperial stouts or high extract stouts that we're familiar with American style stouts so much. The idea is, I guess, even in my wines, in Mira wines, as a somm, I'm always thinking about one thing above all, because my grandfather said to me, the secret to life is one thing, and that's balance. In every great thing, there is balance. A piece of art, a piece of music, a person. And that's what I try above all to construe with my wines and the beer. I want somebody. Too many times I've had beers of this type, of coffees, stouts, or porters, where you have a couple of sips and you say, "Oh, okay, that's interesting, but I can't have any more."
Yeah, I know the feeling. I know the feeling.
And this is not what I want. I want something that's brighter. Yes, that you get a sense that there's coffee and there's that roundness that the rum brings to it, but something that you can drink that is still refreshing, and something that you can have with food. I mean, I think having this with barbecue or a mole dish would be like perfect.
Very cool. Before we go to the next style of beer, there's a question in Puerto Rico from Xiomara about whether they're available already in Puerto Rico, both the wine, the El Pasai, and the beers.
Well, the El Pasai is arriving in Puerto Rico in the next week.
Oh, cool.
A distributor called Fine Wine Imports is going to carry them. And they're also going to bring in the beers. The beers will probably be in Puerto Rico by the end of January.
Wow, that's good turnaround. Very nice. Good work. Yeah. So let's go to the next. And I didn't do these in order. I apologize. I probably should start with the
that's okay. It's okay. So West Indies Pale Ale. So this is my version of an IPA. And the world doesn't need another IPA, right? There's already enough of them. So I decided to do something a little different.
Careful. I am in San Diego, so be careful.
Well, you've already got a bunch of great IPAs in San Diego.
Sure. Okay, I get it.
Precisely the point why we don't need another one. And actually, the brewery that I make this with, Red Clay Brewing Company, actually makes a great IPA. So IPA, India Pale Ale. So I thought, well, I'm going to do something a little different. So this is a West Indies IPA when Mr. Columbus thought India was the other way. And here what we've done, sometimes I feel like IPAs have too much bitterness, too hoppy. And so I wanted something a little bit more restrained. So to add less hops, but still bring that bittering element in a different way, I decided to use dark chocolate from the Dominican Republic And to give it a little spice, we age it in tequila barrels because, of course, Mexico was part of the West Indies at one point. So that's the idea here, to give a different spin altogether on what an IPA is.
That was terrific. I enjoyed all of them, but that was probably my favorite. And then we also have the Forbidden Blade, which has got a great story behind it as well.
Yes. So Forbidden Blade is a black Pilsner. So this always shocks people because you're pouring it. You've told them it's a Pilsner and you pour it and it's black. And they say, wait a minute. I didn't ask for a stout or, a porter or something or a brown ale. And then they drink it. Wait a minute. This tastes like a Pilsner. I've always been a fan of Japanese rice beers. I like the brightness and freshness, and sometimes where they use yuzu, that's citrus fruit, to give it an additional brightness. Mm-hmm. So this is my version of that. And it's black because we use Chinese forbidden black rice. That's why it's called Forbidden Blade. Forbidden because at one point only the Emperor of China was allowed to eat black rice. Thank God those days are over. And then we add Meyer lemon to it because Meyer lemons originate in China.
I didn't know that. That was interesting when you told me that. That was pretty cool. So you got this dark beer with a citrus note to it. It was a lot of fun.
It was a guy called Frank Meyer that brought them to the United States in the early 1900s. So that kind of my version of an Oriental Pilsner.
Very cool. And one of the beers we talked about earlier, the Caribbean Stout, uses coffee. So obviously you decided why not also make a Nitro Coffee. Is that correct?
Exactly. I mean, I obviously, I live in Puerto Rico and I make beer with coffee, so I love coffee. And I thought, well, gosh, we have this coffee, this amazing coffee. Let's do something. Let's do something with that. And so we are. This is a brand new. In fact, today, 400 pounds of an estate called La Perla, the Pearl, which is one of the top coffee estates in Puerto Rico, is on its way to Opelika, Alabama, to get brewed for this, which will be the initial launching of this project, probably in the next month or two.
Very cool. So that's a lot of projects. You had two complete new wine projects, a beer project, a coffee project, and then there's one other project you didn't tell me about. I just happened to stumble upon it. You actually released a book as well. I'm working my way through it, the Mira Affair. I'm really enjoying it. We have it has this relationship between different people. It has some history about the World War I and World War II. It has some philosophy. Jacques in particular stood out as a philosopher for me. You have a Greek Cypriot pilot, which sounds familiar. But I noticed you talk about there's obviously being a master sommelier, there's some talk of Vega Sicilia, about Bordeaux, even Bagnols is mentioned, Armagnac. The part of the book does take place in Italy. I hadn't seen any mention of Italian wines in the book so far. Is that something?
No, that is not on purpose. That is not on purpose because, it's funny. Somebody asked me recently is what were my favorite wines in terms of regions, not particular favorites. I said, well, I guess my favorite wines are the wines that I probably drink the most, and that would be Burgundy, Barolo, and Priorat.
Okay.
And they said, well, why do you think those? I said, because I think perhaps those wines speak more of a place than maybe any other wines. And to me, that's inherently more interesting than what a winemaker can do. I always try to say we try to encapsulate what I think is a special place and not that wine passes through our hands without having too much of our imprint on them. And I think that is the most interesting thing about wine. So I am a fan, Stefano, of Italian wines, especially the wines of Piedmont and the food of Piedmont.
Okay, maybe in volume 2 then of the Mira Fair, we'll have a little bit more timelines. Okay, I see. But no, I really enjoyed the book. So far, I haven't finished it quite yet. I'm about 75% through. But I'm surprised you didn't mention that, because obviously being a Spanish literature degree as well.
Well, and the pandemic gave me a chance to finish it all up and get it published on Amazon. So
because you didn't have enough time with all the other projects that you had so much free time with all the other projects that you're doing. A couple of quick notes from people. There was a question from Pedro about the alcoholic content. I'm guessing in the beer. Pedro, if you're still here, you mentioned that balance was important. So, and the alcohol was a little bit lower than your typical styles.
Yeah. So on the stout, it's 6.5%. On the pale ale, it's 6%, and on the pilsner, it's 4.5%.
Great. So very reasonable, balanced beers. Fantastic. So, are there any other projects that you didn't tell me about that we should talk about before the end of the interview? Because we're getting close there to a.
For the time being, we're getting those going, and then we'll work on. We got a couple of ideas in the back of my head, but first we're going to get especially Lunisa and the coffee project going.
Fantastic. Well, maybe over Christmas dinner, there'll be enough food and wine and spirits that so some of these ideas will loosen up, and we'll see them fruition in 2021. So yeah, I think that's all the questions that I had for you. I don't see any other questions right now on the screen. Is there anything else we haven't talked about? I've kept you for almost an hour now, so I want to let you enjoy your family and the evening. But is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to touch on?
No, I think we've covered most. Working on a restaurant project, but that's a little ways away. So,
restaurant project. What can we tell you? I mean, tell me more about this. Are you going to tell us where in the world this restaurant's going to be?
Okay. We'll wait till it's a little bit come forth more.
Fantastic. Very cool. Very exciting. Well, best of luck to you, Salute. Thank you for your fun project. Oh, Giovanni is saying hello as well. So we had a couple people saying hello and watching us. So I'm sure he'll be very excited to know more about your restaurant, especially if it's in the Americas. Another thing you two can talk about. But I really appreciate your time. This is a phenomenal getting to know more about your projects and your history, and the thought that you put behind everything is really appreciated, at least by me, and it seems like by some other people that are watching. So I appreciate all those connections that you bring together. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on, Stefano.
Perfecto. Well, I will say goodbye to you now, so you can enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you so much for joining us here today. Ciao.
You're welcome. Thank you.
To everybody else, I apologize. I accidentally cut him off there at the end. Thank you so much for following us today. That was a fantastic conversation with Emmanuel Kemiji, the 12th Master Sommelier in the United States, with so many new projects going on. And next week, we're going to talk to Kirk Peterson, a food and wine expert in Las Vegas. He was, we did a show earlier in the year with 2,000 views. So he is the reigning champion so far. So we'll see how the interview goes tonight. But we're going to invite him back and see what's new with him. And then we'll close the year with Giovanni Cardullo to hear his thoughts for 2020 and 2021. So thanks so much for joining us, and be safe, be well, and we'll see you next week. Ciao.